Yeah, you speak from there. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're very pleased to be joined today by Pierre Krähenbühl, the Commissioner General for the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, and he's here to talk to you ahead of his briefing to the ad hoc committee of the General Assembly for the announcement of voluntary contributions. And the Secretary General will also speak at that meeting to urge member states to support UNRWA. Mr. Krähenbühl, we're very pleased to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, good to see you and good to have the opportunity for an update and to brief you on where we stand currently with UNRWA's collective efforts to address needs of Palestine refugees throughout the Near East, but also to address our unprecedented financial situation this year. So let me walk you through some of these issues because indeed we will be organizing and holding today this pledging conference, which is an event that traditionally has taken place during the month of December, but we decided to bring it forward to June because it just helps us to have an actual impact on the financial situation for the remainder of the year. We can still influence events, of course, in June as opposed to December. UNRWA, as you are very familiar with, works in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. We serve a community of 5.3 million Palestine refugees, and our core activities focus on education. We run a school system for over 500,000 boys and girls in these different areas of operation. We also run 140 clinics for primary health care, which receive about 3.5 million patient visits annually. We carry out also microfinance, camp improvement, and protection work as part of our core activities. And then we have emergency operations for about 1.7 million people, predominantly in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, and of course currently in Syria. Just to say a couple of words on the situation of Palestine refugees, it's of course a situation that is defined by great anxiety and uncertainty. First of all, because Palestine refugees do not see a solution to their plight on the horizon. It's now been over 25 years since the Oslo peace process and peace agreement, and the generation that has grown up since, which now makes up the majority of Palestine refugees, really do not see a prospect on the horizon for them, either politically or personally. And to give you just a few examples, if you think of, for instance, the 270,000 Palestine refugee students in UNRWA schools in the Gaza Strip. So we have a total of 526,000 students throughout the region, but 270,000 of them are in the Gaza Strip. And over 90% of them have never left Gaza in their lives. So the only thing that they know is the confines of the Gaza Strip with all of its dynamics of conflict, occupation, blockade, lack of prospects. And these are, of course, dynamics that affect them greatly. So we have a community that is often asking me whether it has been forgotten by the world or whether there is a remainder of attention and concern for it. And, of course, this particular year, this anxiety was compounded by the dramatic deterioration of our funding situation. We began the year with a shortfall that was built into the budget of $146 million, and then had our single largest donor, the country that had been historically the most generous and predictable donor to UNRWA, the United States, reduce its contribution by $300 million. So we suddenly found ourselves with a shortfall of $446 million, affecting the whole range of our services, potentially from education, healthcare to emergency services, and definitely increasing the levels of anxiety and concern among Palestine refugees and UNRWA staff. You are familiar with the fact that 98% of UNRWA staff are Palestine refugees themselves. Now, what we did then was to establish and set forward a multidimensional strategy to address this critical shortfall. There was really no time for pessimism or despair. We had to tackle it because the consequences in terms of human dignity but also regional stability were far too severe for us to contemplate, to simply sit back and allow services to be interrupted. So we did a number of things. Of course, we took a number of internal measures, cost controls, austerity steps. But we then reached out to existing donors to ask them to front-load their expected annual contributions, so to pay earlier in the year. And to their credit, 25 of our historic donors have done that, which is very remarkable as a step. That allowed us to keep schools, clinics, and other services running throughout this entire period. Then we organized on the 15th of March an extraordinary ministerial conference in Rome, attended among many others. The Secretary General was there personally, which I'm extremely grateful for, and the session was co-chaired by the foreign ministers of Sweden, Jordan, and Egypt. We mobilized on that occasion 100 million additional US dollars. Among the key contributors on that occasion, the state of Qatar with 50 million, Turkey, but also Canada. We had important contributions as well from Norway and India, for example. And then we had, following this conference, 2 additional very important contributions, 50 million US dollars from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and 50 million from the United Arab Emirates. So altogether, we have to date mobilized around 200 million additional US dollars. So our shortfall has come down to approximately 250 million. That's where we are currently. Now, that's still extremely critical, and that will be the core of the message today to the pledging conference. While we are immensely grateful for all the support that has come in and has allowed us to keep the schools and clinics open to date, we are now literally running out of money for our emergency work and do not have the guaranteed funding levels to open our school year come the month of August and beginning of September. These are very critical parameters in the context, first of all, because Palestine refugees have always attached great attention and importance to education, but also, just to give an example from Jordan, the Jordanian leadership always insists on the fact that 122,000 Palestine refugee students in UNRWA schools that would no longer have access to education in our schools in Jordan would become a matter of national stability and security in the kingdom. So I think these are parameters that are very significant. This is why we are engaged on knocking at every door to mobilize this additional funding and ensure that our schools, clinics, and other services remain open. We think it is in the interest, in regional terms, both in terms of human dignity, regional stability, but also as an expression of a vibrant multilateral system that we contribute to keeping alive from places as difficult as Aleppo all the way down to the Gaza Strip, with staff members who have shown immense courage. You are aware that we have lost 18 colleagues in the Syrian conflict since its beginning and still have 25 missing. And we lost 11 colleagues in the Gaza conflict in 2014. This shows the levels that UNRWA staff are prepared to go to deliver on the mandate. It's nothing theoretical or academic. It's extremely concrete and makes a huge difference for people. And we definitely hope that member states will join us once again today in this meeting as part of the General Assembly to support UNRWA in this ongoing effort. Thank you so much, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thanks. We'll take some questions. Sharon?
Mr. Krähenbühl, on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, thanks for coming to speak to us. My name is Sherwin Bryce-Pease, South African Broadcasting. Can you speak to the U.S. decision? I know this happened some time back. I mean, if you just sort of recap on the decision, I'm reading some tweets from President Trump at the time. We paid the Palestinians hundreds of millions of dollars a year and get no appreciation or respect. With the Palestinians no longer willing to talk peace, why should we make any of these massive future payments to UNRWA? So how do you address that thinking in the United States? And on a separate note, will you be meeting with the U.S. ambassador to the UN while you're here?
So look, I think the thing is very clear. I have a lot of recognition and respect for the United States and its decision over so many years, actually decades, to be the single most generous and the single largest contributor to UNRWA. We have done remarkable things with U.S. support in the region. And actually, I meet many Palestine refugees who are deeply aware of that support. So I think, as always in the relationship with any individual donor, it's first of all a sovereign decision of a given country to decide at what level and how to support a humanitarian organization. That is clear. Now, I think what was a surprise to me in the decision was that it was not related to UNRWA's performance. In other words, when you meet with a given donor, and that happens all the time, you of course have discussions about the quality of your programs, your accountabilities, the transparency of the organization. That's a very normal conversation to have. And if a donor would say to me, look, we think your performance levels have dropped or you are not transparent enough, then that's something I can work with and I'm happy to address with my colleagues. Here we understand that this was part of a paradigm of discussion and tensions with the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, and that a decision was made to no longer provide assistance to the Palestinians. And whilst historically humanitarian funding had always been protected in Washington, and that was a bipartisan, I think, consensus, it was now decided that humanitarian funding would be impacted by this decision. Of course, from the organization that I represent and from its perspective, I regret that because it has a hugely detrimental impact. And of course, it also doesn't allow us to pursue many of the very positive things that we have done with U.S. support over the years. So yes, we will continue, of course, to engage with the U.S. administration. It's very important to keep the channels open, and I'm always ready for any meetings in that regard.
Aggie?
Hi, Mr. Krähenbühl. I'm Margaret Bashir with the Voice of America. If you could just clarify for me, the money that the shortfall is all for 2017. So we're already nearly 7 months through the year. So what's going to happen with, 2018. So what's going to happen for 2019 then? I mean, you have absolutely no money going, where do you stand? You're just trying to make it through the end of this year, but wouldn't you normally at this point in the year be preparing for the following fiscal year is what I guess I'm trying to ask you. And so then you're just asking for $250 million today, or is there a bigger number you're hoping to achieve? And what do you think you will achieve?
Thank you. So indeed, we are now halfway through the year. And I think when you consider that we needed to overcome a shortfall of 446 million, to have mobilized 200 million over the last 5 months of additional funding, because you have to remember that, of course, we are also receiving the expected funding committed by many other donors, but we needed additional funding to address the shortfall. That's a very good first result for any given year, for any humanitarian organization. The problem for UNRWA is that we run a mix of quasi-state-like services and of emergency response. And we don't have funding reserves, so it's literally what we receive, we spend. And especially this year, where we are, if you want, in a very, very tight and tense financial situation, we need to ensure that the money comes in regularly from the donors, otherwise we have interruptions of services. And if you have interruptions of services like education and healthcare, you can imagine that in any of our countries. That creates a lot of tensions and very big concerns. So right now, we indeed need another 250 million. This we don't expect to be addressed in one go today during the pledging conference, because our experience is that you may have a certain number of additional announcements, but then we have to work bilaterally with donors and member states to mobilize the rest of the funding throughout the remainder of the year. So no doubt that we will have work until the 31st of December to close this particular year, which is going to be very demanding. Then, yes, we do think ahead and we plan for 2019 because, of course, we have to think about the future stability and sustainability of UNRWA's financial situation. And in a way, if you want, the irony of our current dramatic circumstances is that with very significant efforts internally, but also with a report that was published last year by the Secretary General following a very ambitious consultation with member states here in New York, there were a number of new avenues that were being proposed to improve UNRWA's financial stability, such as a World Bank Trust Fund or an endowment fund with the Islamic Development Bank. There were a series of initiatives there. And we had a serious prospect of stabilizing our financial situation. So what we have to do now is to overcome this dramatic shortfall this year and continue to work on this path towards increased stability in coming years. That will be, as if you want, those are two tracks of a global financial strategy that UNRWA is pursuing.
Thank you, Ali Barada from France 24 and Sharq Al-Awsat newspaper. My question, what if you couldn't today or in the coming months overcome this shortfall? What are the programs that are going to be impacted first? And do you have any contingent plans to help the refugees in all various areas that you talked about? Thank you.
Thank you. The most critical and the most immediate areas of risk is the ongoing provision of food assistance to 1 million people in Gaza. So you have a population of approximately 1.9 million people living in Gaza. 1 million people receive food assistance from UNRWA. And if we don't have additional funding coming in, we are now weeks away from an interruption of that particular service. We also have in the Gaza Strip very important work that we carry out, which is for the mental health support to students in our schools. And that's something that has been established and developed following the conflict in 2014. So we have counselors in all of our schools. That may be impacted by emergency funding reductions. Then in the West Bank, it concerns 100,000 people, both Bedouins in their communities, but also Palestine refugees in and outside of camps in the West Bank. Here we're talking about cash for work programs and other forms of support to the community. They are at risk if additional funding is not received. And if you look throughout the region, then, and we look at the core funding, one of the areas that is always the biggest concern for Palestine refugees and also, frankly speaking, for host countries is the provision of our education. 700 schools is what we run for 526,000 boys and girls in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, the West Bank, and Gaza. And for the moment, we don't have the guaranteed levels of core funding for that. Now, you asked for the contingencies. I think, as always, one has to, of course, prepare measures in case the funding doesn't come in. But that is inevitably going to result in concerns, in reactions. We expect protests. And there are big concerns among the community. Today in the Gaza Strip, there were demonstrations in front of our offices in support to UNRWA for its efforts and trying to reach out to say, we do not want services to be interrupted. Let the world mobilize around this, because Palestine refugees and our staff are very aware of what this could mean. In the meantime, we will, as I said, knock on every door and try to make the case that the successful first half of the mobilization this year needs to be protected by mobilizing the rest of the funding. So we will, of course, keep you very much up to date on how this develops in coming weeks.
Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks for the briefing, especially before it. I wanted to ask you about a quote. There's a quote by Saeb Erekat, where he says that the Trump administration is essentially approaching host countries of UNRWA and offering them the funding they would have given to UNRWA. So one, I wanted to know if you know that to be the case, and if you have any comment. And he also says our brothers in Jordan refused Kushner's offer, Jared Kushner. So I wanted to know if you're aware of that, if you have any comment. Number two, what would be the downside? I'm sure there is one, or you'll say there's one, but of this redirection of funds? Are there things that the host governments couldn't do that you can do or have been doing? And the other question is about Syria and your operations there. I saw that you've gotten into Yalda, but it's apparently haven't reached Yarmouk since 2015. Please explain, if you can. I mean, I know it's dangerous, but what are the reasons, and do you anticipate at any future time getting in there? Thanks.
Thanks a lot. So, of course, as you can imagine, I'm not privy to some of the conversations that take place in closed diplomatic and political circles. What I can say is that, of course, it's clear that UNRWA has been recognized by the General Assembly and its members for decades now as an invaluable, and as was quoted recently from the report of the Secretary General last year, indispensable actor in providing both human dignity, preservation of rights, but also, of course, the covering of the essential needs of a very dispossessed and worried community that is a community of 5.3 million people that are simply not just going to go away. And so the question here for me is, how does one address that? And I think today what it requires is definitely a renewed focus on a fundamental political solution that is inclusive of the rights of everyone. Palestine refugees need to be given a choice about their future as part of a political solution, and the international consensus remains that of the two-state solution. So I think that is the avenue and the path that needs to be pursued. In the meantime, UNRWA has received a mandate. We will implement it with great determination and resolve, because we believe it is a very important mandate, and it is one that has given millions of people a horizon and a prospect. Come to think of it in these terms, over 2 million people have graduated from UNRWA schools since the 1950s. That's an invaluable contribution to human development in the region. So the General Assembly is where our mandate is anchored, has originated from, and is protected, and we will see how that develops now in years to come. In the meantime, we need to close this shortfall. That's our biggest priority. And related to your comment on Syria, I think that's another illustration. Syria had 560,000 Palestine refugees before the war began, and there are still approximately 440,000 currently. About 120,000 have fled to neighboring countries and beyond. And Yarmouk was a neighborhood of Damascus that was home to 160,000 Palestine refugees, and that was really the heart, a very vibrant heart of the community for decades. Then the conflict dynamics, both a siege reality and presence of armed groups inside the camp, led to great devastation, massive destruction. And at the end, we had, a couple of months ago, approximately 1,000 to 2,000 people remaining inside Yarmouk. Now, we will see, we have indeed returned to Yalda, and the intention is certainly, as soon as it's possible, to carry out assessments of conditions inside Yarmouk. This is important to see how things will develop also for the community, what prospects are there. So we are very determined, and we are ready at any time to carry out such a mission.
Thank you, Mr. Krähenbühl, for your briefing. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. I have a few questions. First, from your contact with refugees, what does UNRWA mean to them? Is it just a source of just food and clinics and just support in emergency cases, or much more than that? After 70 years of displacement, dispossession, and losing their homes and land. And the second, there are many rumors about UNRWA comes from the enemies of UNRWA. And why UNRWA doesn't engage in a very comprehensive campaign to dispel those rumors, which is aimed at distortion and at spreading bad image of UNRWA and overlooking the great achievements of UNRWA. And there are even some countries who spoke lately against UNRWA, including your own country, Switzerland. And I was surprised that the foreign minister spoke some negative, he gave some negative statements about UNRWA. Have you explained things to the government of Switzerland why he issued this strange statement? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe to start with that point on dispelling rumors. I think you know that we work in one of the most polarized regions of the world, and so it's not surprising that there's plenty of comments and counter-comments on an organization like UNRWA or on the situation of Palestine refugees. It's because of the polarization. Everything that we say or don't say, do or don't do, is under close scrutiny. Now, it's true, we do spend a significant amount of time of addressing comments and at times criticism. We're also very happy to address a lot of the praise and solidarity that comes our way, and it's not insignificant in any sense. On the contrary, I've been very impressed this year about how much solidarity has been expressed and how many initiatives. You know, we had a former UNRWA student who is a cancer survivor and amputee who went all the way up to the base camp of Mount Everest to mobilize funding for his school to preserve and protect it. So we have multiple examples of this this year. Now, of course, one has to address the criticism, and I was, also did have opportunities in Switzerland to address some of the points that were raised by the foreign minister. But I think the most important issue was that the very day after the comments were made by the foreign minister, the Swiss president and the government actually clarified its position, that the position of Switzerland had not changed on the Middle East, and certainly the support and what they called strategic partnership with UNRWA had not changed. And this was for me very important as a clarification. So I'm not surprised. Wherever I travel, I do have questions coming up, and they need to be addressed. Then you asked, what does UNRWA represent for Palestine refugees? You know, every year we have the opportunity to meet here in New York, and at times it is when I deliver my statement at the 4th Committee of the General Assembly, which is the annual report of UNRWA. And I just want to tell you what happens when I go back to the region, when I go to Gaza or to Lebanon and meet with Palestine refugees. They have read the statement, and I think that's a fairly unique experience in the humanitarian field. Palestine refugees will give me a feedback. They will say, Commissioner General, we thought this was an interesting part. This was a bit weak. That was reflected our reality. It's important you highlight it. And so I think it gives a sense of the very strong attachment that Palestine refugees feel to UNRWA as an organization, because we stand for their rights and for the dignity of Palestine refugees. But I have to say that I don't believe that I have ever met a Palestine refugee, first of all, who wanted to be a refugee, nor have I certainly ever met a refugee who wanted to remain a refugee, certainly not as long. And so the attachment to UNRWA is in the absence of something else. And what is that something else? That something else is a political solution that enables Palestinians at large, but also Palestine refugees, to define the future of their own as part of a state of their own, and to have the dignity that we have all known to actually contribute to the development of our own community and of our country on the basis of agreed principles in the region. So I think, it is an attachment in the absence of something else. But we think that until that something else has been achieved, we will proudly continue to pursue and implement our mandate.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Masood Haider. I represent Daily Dawn newspaper of Pakistan. Sir, of the 11 countries which have agreed to pay forward, as you said, and have you had conversations with them to to make sure that their contribution continues? And do you believe that this shortfall of 200 million that you're talking about can be fulfilled within time? Because next year you again saddled with shortfalls. So do you have any sort of commitment from these 11 countries who have already paid forward and so forth? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So 2 things are important for this year, then I'll come to the question on next year. So to date, we have actually 25 countries in the meantime that have agreed to advance their funding to earlier in the year. And this is truly very significant. And then we have a number of countries that have provided additional funding. Now, your point is very important in relation to those who have provided now additional funding. We, of course, when a donor gives UNRWA money this year, it doesn't necessarily imply that it will give the same amount the following year. However, we do have now approximately 18 countries and institutions that provide UNRWA with multi-year funding, which, by the way, was one of the key areas of focus of the World Humanitarian Summit, in the commitments made by member states and donors to increase the number of multi-year agreements for humanitarian organizations. Because for us, of course, the more multi-year agreements we have, the more predictable our funding situation becomes. Then we can rely on certain levels over a 3, 4, 5-year period. So we will see how many of the donors that have contributed additional money this year would be prepared to sit down with us for multi-year support. But it is clear that the experience of almost every humanitarian organization, and that's clearly the case for UNRWA, is that, your financial situation will never be comfortable. That's not the idea. It's rarely the case. But at least that it becomes more stable and a bit more predictable, that is certainly highly desirable from an UNRWA perspective.
Yes, Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. I want to go back to the statement you made in response to the previous question. When you said that the Palestinian refugees do not want to remain in the refugee status, they want to attach themselves to something greater than that. And this goes to the fundamental mission of UNRWA. Would UNRWA's mission in support of the Palestinian refugees end with the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, at least with respect to the people in Gaza and the West Bank, with the establishment of an independent Palestinian state encompassing those territories? And related to that, does UNRWA see as part of its mission the fulfillment of the so-called right of return, which does appear in some of the UNRWA-supported textbooks in schools? In other words, even with independence, does UNRWA see its mission continuing until the refugees it's been supporting could exercise the right of return to pre-1967 Israel? Thank you.
Thank you. So two aspects on this. So take the example of the Oslo peace process. What was planned at the time was a 5 to 10 year transition period during which UNRWA would have handed over its services, installations, part of our staff to the nascent Palestinian Authority, and that was always foreseen that UNRWA's existence would come to an end if a lasting solution had been found that enabled Palestine refugees to exercise a choice about their future. Now, it is not for UNRWA to determine the parameters in political terms of the solution. Simply, we are there to provide services until such a day that this solution has been negotiated and implemented. And that was foreseen with the Oslo process. So to come to your question specifically, if an independent Palestinian state were established, that would definitely be the prospect that UNRWA would hand over, and I presume then the General Assembly would look closely about the need for the continuation of UNRWA beyond that. So I think this is very clear. About the right of return, this is obviously a very sensitive issue in the context of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, but we have to just remember it is a right enshrined in UN General Assembly resolutions. Now, it's not UNRWA's role to advocate for the political solutions and whatever the solution should be in relation to Palestine refugees. That is not our role. It's in UN General Assembly resolutions. I think that's clear enough. The rest of it, however, means that UNRWA's role is simply to focus on the humanitarian and development mandate until that a solution has been found. So again, I think those are the parameters, and they're fairly clear. We don't want to mix our role with the politics of finding the solution, but the day that a solution is found that is just and inclusive of Palestine refugees, then I think it's also time for a different future for UNRWA.
Commissioner General James Bays from Al Jazeera. I wonder if you could give some of us who will be covering your meeting this afternoon a guide to what we would expect this afternoon. Your meeting starts at 3. Would you expect to have the pledges by the start of the meeting 3? How important is this afternoon or in actually raising the money? Should we pronounce at the end of 6 o'clock that you haven't raised the money and it's disaster for UNRWA? Can you give us some sort of idea of how it will work?
Sure, thank you. So if you take the pledging conference as an important moment in our strategy this year to address the shortfall. It is both a very important moment and it is one of a series of moments, right? So I don't think we should focus all of our expectations on resolving a shortfall of 250 million in one go today. And the reason for that is what you can expect, I believe, is a strong political support expressed to UNRWA, a renewed commitment, an emphasis of its indispensable role. And then we could expect a certain number of countries to make announcements in financial terms. We will have to conclude at the end of the day how much of those announcements will be additional funding versus announcement in relation to annual commitments. So we will have to give you a sense as we come out of it. I have no doubt that it will be a very important meeting, and I have no doubt that it will not resolve all of our funding problems this year. So let us give you an assessment as we come out of the conference of exactly how far we have gone. It's definitely going to be one of the steps, but I have no doubt we'll be back for more steps later.
Verena Dobnik, Associated Press. So the U.S. cut $300 million for this year, and did the U.S. give anything this year? Like, is it $0? I mean.
So the U.S. contribution this year was 60 million, and in 2017 it was 364 million. That's where the difference comes from, the 300 million. But a contribution of 60 million was made earlier this year. It was received, and so it is part of the important contributions.
For this year,
yes.
Right. And can we say, I mean, it's a decision made by, I'm sure, many officials, but can we say that the president okayed this funding cut himself?
That I don't know exactly the nature of the discussions that took place internally. No doubt it was a senior level decision, but exactly what the discussions were and who participated in them, that I'm not aware.
So the Trump administration, we
the
can say.
The Trump administration.
George Baumgarten, correspondent for Jewish newspapers in North America and other media far afield, various places. I want to follow up on Sherwin's original question, if I may, Commissioner General, and dig a little deeper into what you have been told by the Americans. You've given me to understand that they were very clear that their cut in funding was not due to UNRWA's performance. What was their explanation, in their words, as best you recall it, for the reason for their cut in funding?
So the reason why I mentioned that there was no relation to the performance is that in November last year I visited Washington, and it was a very positive visit with a lot of positive feedbacks about our performance and about many of the issues that we deal with, some of them very challenging issues, including related to the neutrality of the agency and others. And these were important feedbacks to hear. And we actually signed a new framework agreement with the United States based on, these are framework agreements that one signs with all of our donors for the next phase of the relationship, the partnership, and the funding. So at that time, things were set on a course that were clearly identifiable and we could consider as very predictable and positive in the relationship. And the reason why I therefore say that there is no relationship to the performance of UNRWA is that the decision seems to then have come after the debates that took place here at the General Assembly, in particular on the question of Jerusalem, and then the decision was announced by the U.S. administration to no longer provide funding to Palestinians at large. The communication to us was simply that the contribution that was going to be made to UNRWA was going to amount to 60 million this year. That was the communication. And therefore, since then, our dialogue is, of course, on continuing to explain what UNRWA does and how we do it, and to seek information about whether this may change at any time in the future. For the moment, I have no indications that that decision may change.
So just following up a little, if I may, they have not given you any further explanation other than It's reduced to 60 million for this year. That's our contribution for 2018. No further explanation.
In specific terms of, you would have to do this for that to change? No, that we don't have that.
I believe, I guess, I have to go with
Yes. Stefano Vaccara, Radio Radicale in Rome, La Voce di New York. I arrived late, so I don't know if you addressed this, but Ambassador Eli often said in the General Assembly in this building that the Palestinian refugee issue and the Palestinian issue, Israeli-Palestinian issue in general, is not the only issues. There are many about refugees. She started to mention all the refugees around the world. So I ask you, what you make about this when she says, when the ambassador of US says something like this? You think it's related somehow also on maybe the funds? Do you know anything if these funds that they were not giving to UNRWA are now given to other refugees emergency?
Well, maybe just the first part of your question, I think, is just a factual observation that there are many other refugee situations around the world. The reality is that of the protracted long-term refugee community, Palestine refugees still represent about 30% worldwide. So it's a significant community. Now, it has been the case for many decades that the situation has remained unresolved. But of course, if you look at it from the point of view of other refugee communities in the world, if you take Afghan refugees or if you take other communities, there are also other long-term refugee communities, no doubt about it, that deserve a lot of attention. So the point isn't that we're saying that Palestine refugees are the only ones to deserve attention. But I think I see a big difference between Palestine refugees and many other refugee communities, and that is the fact that if today you are an Afghan refugee sitting in Peshawar, and you have been there since, say, the Soviet invasion of 1979, you can still, despite all the difficulties, decide that it has been long enough and you want to return to a country that is your own, that is called an independent state of Afghanistan. That is, in the absence of a political solution, currently not possible for Palestine refugees to exercise a choice in that regard. And that brings us back to the situation and to the question that was made earlier. So I just want to say, I think for the international community, it is not that we should say one should focus exclusively on Palestine refugees, but we should not overlook the long-term consequences on dignity, but also on stability in the Middle East, if one were no longer in a position to address the needs of a community of 5.3 million people. This is, I think, why it's so important to stand there and to build on the investment that donors, including the United States, have made with and through UNRWA for decades in terms of human development. That, I think, is a very worthwhile enterprise.
Just a quick clarifying question, just a quick one on that, which is, isn't one other unique difference the fact that with the Palestinian refugees, the status is handed down from generation to generation, swelling the original number of 700,000 to 5 million. Isn't that unique as opposed to refugees anywhere else in the world?
So I'm glad you raised that, because that is one of the greatest misrepresentations that keep accompanying UNRWA's work. I just spoke about the situation of Afghan refugees. So arguably, Afghans have been refugees for 40 years, not yet 70. But you can ask the UNHCR, when they deal with the children and grandchildren of the original refugees from 1979 who are in Peshawar, in Pakistan, or in Iran, of course they address them as refugees as well. So there is no difference in that regard. And, I have worked in many conflict zones where you have refugee situations, whether it is with UNRWA or previously with the Red Cross. And the international community finds it very important to bring about durable solutions for refugees. And this should include a focus on Palestine refugees. Durable solutions are essential to bring stability. And it is clear that other refugees in the world, their children and grandchildren, of course, also be considered as such.
Thank you very much. And I hope you have a very productive afternoon.
Thank you so much, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention and interest. Thank you.